Well, we're going to discuss global hymnody. I hope that's what you're here for. Have you all had the opportunity to sit in some of John Bell's sessions? Did you get to go to the one yesterday morning specifically? You did? Okay, good. So if you didn't, that's perfectly fine. But he did a fine job of presenting a bit of why we should sing other people's songs and examples of songs from different parts of the world. Our aim is to be very practical about this. Jacob and I have both written a few papers on the things on global hymnody, but more importantly, we've actually used it in our congregations. Not extensively, but we've introduced it to congregations, and it's gone on pretty well with that. So our goal is to give you a bit of background on global hymnody, what it is, how it came about, why we would use it, and then a few practical tips on how to use it with your congregation, how to introduce the songs and teach the songs, and then to share with you some resources that we found. You'll see most of the handout is taken up by that resource list, so we'll discuss a few of those things. Please feel free to ask questions or give comments throughout the presentation. We'd rather this be more of an informal discussion than a formal lecture or something. So bring up issues as they come along. I guess we should introduce ourselves.
Yeah. So I'm Jacob Sensenig. I am a PhD student here at Baylor. Just finished my first year in the PhD program, but I did my Master's of Divinity and Master's in Church Music both here at Baylor. So I've been around for 6 years and attending Alleluia now. This is my 8th Alleluia conference. So I've been around a little while. But I serve in a small church about an hour west of here in Hamilton, Texas. A church that runs about 1:30, 1:40 on a Sunday morning, something in that range. But it's a town that is 95, 96% Anglo. So talking about global hymnody and singing global hymnody where there isn't really a good picture of the globe it can be a challenge. And working with those people and introducing new songs to them can be a challenge. Luckily, fortunately, I serve a church that's really open to learning new things and to trying new things and to reaching out to the globe. And so we've done lots of things, and I'll talk about some of that as we go forward. The way we introduce songs and how that's become meaningful to our congregation. I also lead worship for the Truett Seminary, which is where I've been able to lead more global songs than in my local church. Obviously, there are more students from around the globe here, which opens up some possibilities there. But it's also true. It has, one of the pushes is global impact and global missions, and so that opens up a lot of doors as well for us to sing new things. We have the Celebrating Grace hymnal in the pews, and there are only 7 or 8 songs that you might consider global hymnody in there. Actually, there's probably more if you consider the Taizé chants, and I would probably, but I think in the back, in the index, they have a section that says global hymns, and there are 7 songs or something like that in it. But we'll talk a little more about that. Stephen.
And my name is Cowden. I graduated in May from the Master of Music and Master of Divinity programs here at Baylor and Truett. While I was in Waco, I served at First Baptist Mart, and I served as interim at First Baptist Clifton, and did some unpaid ministry at Cowden Baptist Church here in Waco. So I've attended a few places. I've used some global song in a couple of those places. At the top of the handout, you'll see our emails, and let me say up front that if you want to email me any questions or ideas or where would I find this or something, feel free to let me know. And all the stuff that I don't know, I'll also ask my circles and see who knows what we're trying to find out.
Stephen and I both got introduced to doing a lot of global hymnody by one of our former professors here, Dr. Swee Hong Lim, who's now teaching in Toronto. But he kind of saw that we had an interest in it and fostered that interest in a lot of ways. So we do owe a lot to him in that regard, and to his being from Singapore and opening up windows for us into Asian hymnody and working with so many other people through the World Council of Churches and other organizations to where we've gotten to meet a lot of the names that you'll hear and have conversations with the people that you'll see on the resource list. So that was a great experience for us and kind of got this stirred up within us as well.
Well, why don't you talk a bit about what is global hymnody?
Yeah, so it's a little ambiguous, and as you talk to different people, you'll hear different kind of definitions, and sometimes you'll hear world song or global hymnody or ethnic song, and so the terms in some sense are interchangeable, and in some sense they can be very specific. So I think you have to be careful and realize what context you're talking in. In past decades, global hymnody implied hymns from other parts of the world, so other than North America or European or Europe. If you want a deeper understanding, I think the answer is as complicated as you make it. You can keep peeling away the layers, and it's just going to get more and more difficult to define. You have to keep using qualifiers, and so we're going to talk about it kind of in its global sense, in the bigger picture. We can think of Christian communal song from a society or culture other than our own. That's kind of our definition. That can include hymnody from other continents, but it could also include music developed here in North America by other ethnicities than our own, or even people outside of our own community. So the term global hymnody is kind of a misnomer in some sense. Maybe ethnic hymnody might be a better term. With this definition, we should remember that our hymnody, even if we're creating our own music, is foreign to others. So to them, it's global hymnody or ethnic hymnody or whatever term you decide to use, and we'll leave that up to you. What we're actually doing is just sharing. It's sharing our song with one another from different points around the globe, around the country, different communities with one another. And I think that's what we want you to take away from this, is that your song can be global song elsewhere. We've done a lot of music mission trips from Baylor in the last couple of years to Kenya, Malaysia, and El Salvador this summer. And we're going back to Malaysia next summer. And one of the really interesting things in Malaysia is they wanted to sing our songs, and I think that's coming from you could go back to, imperialism and colonialism and all that good stuff and find roots for all of that. But they're wanting to sing our song, and we're coming back to them with their own songs. So there's this interchange and this sharing that's taking place, and it's a beautiful thing, and I hope that you can get to experience some of that as well, maybe in local churches, but also in other fields.
Yeah. Perspective is key with global hymnody, because to somebody not from here, not in our group, our song is global to them. Who can name me a well-known hymn that came from Northeast India during the middle of the 19th century? Its tune is a psalm.
You think about I have decided to follow Jesus?
Yes. Yeah, and arranged and popularized by William J. Reynolds. Do you suppose that tune would be sung the same in India as here? Probably not. It probably wouldn't be accompanied the same. The melodic figures wouldn't sound just like we do it.
Not a whole lot of major thirds.
Yeah, the harmony would probably be a bit different. And so it's good to consider that while perhaps that tune came from elsewhere, it's contextualized here. And maybe our music, when it goes elsewhere, is contextualized there. So one of the issues we'll deal with later is, what is the original song, and how do we use that with a congregation that maybe can't sing the song as it originally was done? We'll get to that later. Just a real brief history of global hymnody. So technically, it's been around for a while, but the real dissemination of global hymns began after the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, because Vatican II said that churches should use indigenous musical forms in their worship. And so suddenly it became okay to sing something besides European and North American hymnody in the Catholic Church. And that council had widespread impact among Protestants too. And so Protestants started to think the same way and to say, well, maybe we should consider what would be indigenous from other people, and then maybe we can share that. The World Council of Churches really took note of that direction, and starting in 1983 at their Vancouver assembly, they started to use indigenous worship elements in their gatherings. So the WCC group included a lot of global hymnologists, names such as Per Harling from Sweden, Ito Lo from Taiwan, Patrick Matsikinieri from Zimbabwe, Pablo Sosa from Argentina, Sime Montero from Brazil, and Sui Hong Lim from Singapore. And I would also add Michael Hahn from Dallas. This group was kind of the beginnings of the spread of global hymnody. So they would go and collect and share and learn from everybody they knew, kind of pool their resources, use the hymns at the WCC assemblies every few years, and put out occasional publications. However, in 1996, the WCC lost the ability to fund this sort of research into global hymnody. So St. Kimbrough, United Methodist, took over the program of global hymnody. And for a few years, about 10 years, the Global Praise Program of the Methodist General Board of Global Ministries published global hymns. These 3 books are the main resources that were published by Global Praise.
They got really creative with the titles: Global Praise 1, Global Praise 2, and Global Praise 3.
Yeah.
So they spent a lot of time working on the title of these books.
And if you wanted a lot of global hymns from a lot of different places, crammed into some volumes, these are the ones that you want. They're not necessarily the most user-friendly, in my opinion, but I mean, it's kind of the canon of global song as of 1 or 2 decades ago. Well, unfortunately, in 2006, that program lost funding due to change in leadership with the United Methodist Global Board. And so right now, there's no central organization publishing global hymnody. You've got publications here and there among North American publishers and a few other groups around the world, but there's no one organization really leading the charge with global hymnody. Hymnologists don't have much funding now to go do global research. We get some from ethnodoxologists, but their aim is a little bit different from congregational use. Still, the work goes on, and it happens mostly in relationships. So last summer I was invited to a workshop. It was hosted by Council for World Mission, which is a mission group based in Singapore. So they hosted a workshop in Kingston, Jamaica, and about 16 people, one or two from every continent. So we had every continent represented. We had every major Christian faith tradition represented here too. So our purpose was to get together, discuss what's going on in the global church, and then start creating resources for global use and worship. So they structured it. We had the generation of Simo Montero and Per Harling. We had those folks, and they intentionally invited several folks from my generation around the world to learn from the others and to develop friendships with the others so that we can carry on the work of finding and using global hymns. It was a great experience. We'll do a publication that will come out next year from CWM, but I think the most important thing from that conference is the relationships developed, because now I personally know these people who have worked with global hymns, and I can go to them as resources or ask them what's new. Another note would be last week at the Hymn Society conference, the Hymn Society in the United States and Canada. We met in New Orleans last week, and one of the sessions was on Japanese hymnody, presented by a student in Toronto who's from Tokyo. So she talked about a bit of the history of Christianity in Japan. She talked about history of church music in Japan, and she talked about what they're singing now. So she shared several songs. We sang 5 or 6. One of them, toward the end of the presentation, had been translated into English but not versified. And you know what that means. There's a literal translation, but we can't actually sing it to the music. So behind me was Dan Damon, who's a fairly well-known hymn writer today. And afterward, he said to the presenter, if you will translate the Japanese text directly into English, send that to me, and then I'll versify it so that we can put it out and use it. So this was last week, you know. So this work is ongoing, and it's through collaboration. Whenever folks who are interested in global song get together, they start talking and realize, you know, there's more out there, and it's being created every day. So the history is ongoing, is what I'm trying to say.
We're going to talk about it now. Do you have any questions about the history of that? We might not be able to answer it because we've only been in it we've only been a part of that history for a couple of years. But we've spent quite a bit of time researching it and looking at it. Are there any questions before we move on? Yeah.
When you say global hymnody, and again, I don't want to get too specific.
Yeah, no.
I don't want to do that, but folk song-like versus, are these basically songs used in the church? And just in any style, any genre, any is considered generally global hymnody?
Shall I answer?
Yeah, good.
Originally, the group of folks that I listed working with WCC were primarily interested in indigenous music from various cultures that's used in the church. So Taiwanese folk music appropriated for use in the church. Ito Lo, he's the
Premier
Asian global hymnologist. He says that cultures should develop music for the church that are indigenous to those cultures. So you need to go back in your own history. Do not import other people's music into the church. It needs to be authentic. And then likewise, when we sing songs from the Taiwanese church, we need to sing them authentically as they would. Sui Hong is a student of his. Sui Hong has moved on to say, well, it's contextual. So we can't sing that song just as the Taiwanese church would sing it. We need to sing it in our own way. Furthermore, the reality is Taiwanese culture is more global than very indigenous. Does that make sense? So it's perfectly fine to mix styles because that is our actual culture, is this coming together style. So long answer is, in the past it was mostly folk type hymnody. Today it's a mixture of whatever the church is actually using.
It's that difference between cultivated and vernacular, I think. You know, we look at cultivated musical traditions coming out of it. You start with the vernacular, you know, the people singing their indigenous song, and then you, over time, begin to work in, and that happened all throughout American church music history, and European church music history and all of that. They begin to work it into hymnals and fitting it into the musical styles that are in place in classical world and whatnot. And it becomes this cultivated tradition. And I think that's happened with global hymnody as well. And now you have, we'll talk about the International Council of Ethnodoxologists a little bit. As Stephen was saying, a lot of the proponents of global hymnody in the circles that we've run are moving away from the strict performance practice kind of mentality to making it more usable, I think, for our congregations. But there is also this, in the International Council of Ethnodoxologists, this push back towards strict performance practice and utilizing music that is not necessarily born in the church, but creating music for the church that sounds like the indigenous music. I think, which is the other going the other direction, taking things that were originally done in the culture, but now creating things for the culture that sound like the culture. And that gets really tricky, I think. Yeah, question.
Isn't it true that a lot of other cultures, Mideast, Oriental, the tunings are different?
Oh, yeah.
They don't use the same tunings that we have, and they use instrumentation that we don't have access to, so it's extremely difficult to do it in the original way in our
Absolutely.
culture.
And you hear, not just even the tunings, the melodies are so foreign, for lack of a better term, to our ears. When I try to do, you'll hear, sing a couple things in a minute, but if you look at South American hymnody or African hymnody, most of your congregations will pick those up pretty quickly. Mine does. But anytime I've tried to do an Asian song, we've struggled. Almost every time. And in any context that I've tried to do it, there's rare exceptions. But it's something about the intervals and the way the melodies flow that's harder to pick up. I'm getting to where I can do it easier now personally, but it's been living in that for a little while, is what it took. Yeah.
You may be intending to address this, but we're talking about trying to translate this into English.
Mm-hmm.
But how important, how valuable is it maybe to the church to at least in part sing it in the language in which it was written, as long as they understand,
Yes.
as long as, you could do it maybe kind of bilingually, but it just seems to me that there is some value to that. And also, is there value in singing a song, from the international church, whether it quote unquote fits the service, or is there just value in raising that awareness and consciousness that, hey, we have brothers across the sea, we're not the only showing in the world, is there value in just in that?
Absolutely, I think for both of those points. And we were going to get to the translation kind of issue. No, that's great.
We'll get to both
Those
of
are questions that we were hoping to bring up, so that's wonderful. Let's move on just a little bit about the question of why you use global hymnody. And there are a lot of answers, and we could give you a whole bunch of them. On your handout, you might want to write a few of these down. I don't think we put them there. First is the musical reason. And I don't think I have to explain to anybody in this room the power of music and the way different musics affect people differently. What are some musical reasons that you might want to use global hymnody in your church? Obviously, you've thought about it, or you probably wouldn't be here. But what are some of the musical reasons that you might want to?
Just what he said, just to make people aware, hey, we're not the only gang in town. There are other cultures that worship in different ways, and their equivalent of blessed assurance may not be the same as what we think of.
Right. Actually, to that point, there's a recent volume that was put out with Sui Hong Lim and Ito Lo, and I forget who all the other composers were. There were a bunch where they took a bunch of Fanny Crosby texts and reset them to sound like global songs. And it's the strangest thing, worlds colliding, kind of stuff. But it's a lot of fun I haven't actually sung through any of them in a congregational setting, but it's fun to look at least. And they took texts that nobody knew too. They took Blessed Assurance is one of those that they used, but there are others. What's another musical reason that you might want to do that? Might use global hymnody?
I've used it in really traditional churches to ease them out of their comfort zone.
Yeah.
Because then it's, politically correct and culturally sensitive.
That balance of the prophetic and the pastoral. So there's a pastoral reason for doing it, but it's kind of working its way in there to stretch the mind a little bit, and the theology maybe a little bit.
And
as
introduce
well.
Instruments other than the organ.
Absolutely, yeah, and you find, at least I find it surprisingly, people surprisingly open to singing global song in churches that are primarily organ driven, and maybe some of that is a theological issue with some of those churches, but I think musically people want to hear things that I think people are more open musically than we give them credit for most of the time, and because we only hear the complainers, right? We don't really usually hear the people who are really excited about it and think things are going well. They don't come talk to us. It's always the people who are upset. So I think, yeah, you're right, that there are lots of churches that are open to hearing that difference in instrumentation. Yeah, absolutely. I think you have a difference in energy level sometimes with those songs. We'll also talk in a moment about kind of the form of some of these songs and how form affects placement in the worship order, or affects how you would teach or sing a song. And form, I think, is very important when looking at global hymnody, maybe more so than looking at our own songs. But looking at form and deals with a lot of different things. But musically, you can build a lot of energy with some of these songs that you might not be able to do with a 4 or 5 or 6 stanza hymn, where there's that much text in every single line. It has a lot of text. So musical reasons, I think you can build energy and diversify a little bit. There's spiritual reasons, right, for doing it. It opens up the mind and the being in a new and a fresh way. Opens up our spirits to hearing new things about God. There are lots of reasons there. But moving on, the theological reason, right? Why we should do it. We often restrict our own belief our belief in God to our own personal experience, limiting our understanding of who God is. Global hymns open us up to aspects of theology that we in the North American church often rarely consider, such as liberation theology. It's coming from that South American, Central American concept that God favors the poor in some sense. And while my church is not a liberation theology church, I don't think very many people in my church would espouse liberation theology or even know what liberation theology is. I think we can sing songs that came out of that movement to help us to recognize the plight of the poor, and see that in our own community by singing songs from another part of the world. Lament. I think there's a push in the contemporary church towards bringing lament back into our practice, because so many, and that seems odd to say, because when you think of contemporary church, and I'm not talking contemporary musical style church, but when you think of them as a musical style and genre, you often think about refusing to sing songs that are sad, refusing to sing songs that talk about our brokenness. But I don't think that's the case any longer. That might have been the case 5 or 6 years ago, but there's a push in contemporary Christian music and in the contemporary church as a whole, that's meaning today's church, not just doing that musical style. There's a push in the contemporary church to bring back a fully orbed understanding of who we are as people, modeling it after the Psalms. That there is this, there are all these songs that speak of lament and desperation. And I think that that's coming back into the church, and global songs can help us do that. Opening ourselves to other perspectives really does help us to become well-balanced Christians, I think. There's an ecumenical reason as well, and it's one of my favorites. I think this is one of the easiest ways to begin to use global hymnody is talking about it as an ecumenical concept. So what does that mean? Other denominations coming together, bringing together Christians of different faith traditions. So using global hymnody is deeper than just intercession for them. It allows us to pray with them. So often, and I've heard it articulated that way so many times in worship services that I've attended that have used global song. We're going to pray for our brothers and sisters around the globe by singing this song. And I think it's more singing with them. We can pray for them and with them. It's not an either or.
Can I share this quote?
Yeah, absolutely.
So S.T. Kimbrough, who's done a lot of the theological work on why to use global hymnody, has this great quote. He says, "Global hymnody contradicts an isolated or immured spirituality that fosters a personal spiritual ego massage to the exclusion of others." So, in other words, sometimes I tend to get into the mindset of my view of God is the view of God. Everybody else is, maybe they're close, but I'm right, and it's just massaging my own ego, my own spiritual ego, as he says. So when we use hymnody from the perspective of other Christians, we realize that maybe there's something they have thought of that I haven't thought of. and we need that sharing. That's what makes us the church rather than the church. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And there's this, what really arrests me and what kind of convicts me is this picture in Revelation around the throne, every tribe and language and people and nation, and, the way global hymnody fits right into that.
Absolutely.
We are a reflection on earth of what is going to happen in heaven. I'm not sure exactly what that will be like up there, but
Sure.
it does say every language.
Yeah.
And there's something, there's kind of a, not only are you connecting with people horizontally, but you're connecting with people linearly, I guess you'd say, just in terms of the future, what the
Right.
future will look like.
And there's no better way than to just get out and have those experiences. It's hard to have that Revelation 5 kind of experience here in North America sometimes. Central Texas, I think, is difficult. I was fortunate enough in 2013 to go to the Iona community in Scotland. John Bell and I missed each other by a week. So I lived on the island for 8 weeks and served as music assistant in the Abbey. So we had visitors coming from all over the globe to spend a week living and worshiping and fellowshipping together. And we would do it every Sunday evening. We sang a lot of global songs throughout the week in the services, morning and evening prayer services. But on Sunday evening, we did a Taizé-style service that I was fortunate enough to be able to lead. And that on Sunday evenings, we would sing in 5, 6, 7, 8 languages, all at the same time. And you hear this, it's a cacophony of sound in some senses, because you can't really pick out sometimes what language who is singing. But I knew those people intimately. And so I knew their hearts, and I could pick out voices, and languages. And it was just the neatest experience. And if you can go to Taizé in France, it's even more so that. But I think that those experiences are hard to recreate, and sometimes we have to go find those. And that's a difficult thing, but I think making that a spiritual pilgrimage in some sense is a great way to go about it in your own journey towards global hymnody. The last reason we'll talk about is the missional reason, which probably doesn't really need much of an explanation. As I said, it's difficult sometimes in Central Texas to find a convergence of cultures, but if you go right up the road to Dallas or right south to Austin or further south to San Antonio or to Houston, you're going to find the global church has come to meet us. It really has. And you can't escape that. In Hamilton, Texas, that's not the case. But in the major cities in North America, on one street you've got a district of Lebanese people, and on another street it's immigrants from Africa, or refugees from Africa. And so it's there's a missional reason there. You're singing the songs of the people around you. They've come to us, not just us going to them any longer, and taking our song to them. And so there's, I just love that picture that you're talking about. It's beginning to happen here. Yeah. Think of it as a meal. We took a seminar last fall with an ethnomusicology professor here at Baylor, and he's also a foodie. Like, that's what he does. He loves coffee and whatever. He's all about the food and the drinks that he consumes and talking about them all the time. And so we often got into discussions of looking at music by way of food, and he would bring stuff to us in class, which was a great perk of being in that class. But we talked one day about as Pico de Gallo, as the convergence of musical cultures. Somebody brings the tomato, and somebody brings the onion, and somebody brings the pepper, and somebody brings whatever else, cilantro, and whatever. And so I really like that analogy. It made sense to us, and I think that sharing that, because once it's all there together, you have a totally different experience than you do if one of those pieces is missing. So that was a great picture.
Yeah. We'd better pick up the
pace.
But I was curious, do any of these reasons tend to resonate particularly with you, or Are there other reasons for using global hymnody that are significant to you and your church? So I'm asking, what of this is significant in your context?
I'm in a very blended church in terms of culture.
Yeah.
And so I'm in Houston and I've got one of those churches.
Yeah.
So we're working on it. It's still an Episcopal church and it's still very, very square. But we know that in our congregation, there are people for whom the hymnal and what comes out of the hymnal is not home.
Yeah.
So you're living in that mission reality, where mission doesn't mean overseas. Mission is my neighborhood,
At home.
at my church,
As it always should be. I think that's we've so often talked about missions as abroad and totally forget about the mission responsibility in our own neighborhoods. And so maybe global hymnody in some senses helps us with that. Michael Hahn talks about that as reverse missions. I forget, I think it's Gavin, no, I'm good.
I think
It is, I don't remember which, one of Michael Hahn's books talks about, has a chapter on reverse missions and how the way global hymnody helps us to rethink about missions in our own context.
Well, let's keep going. Now we'll get to the down-to-earth nitty-gritty. How does global hymnody fit in worship? The answer is really pretty simple. It fits right alongside our own Western hymnody. So the real question to ask would be, how does this song fit in our worship? So I think you've got to start with what's familiar with a congregation and move from there toward the unfamiliar. Don't just pick a song in Mandarin, throw it up on the screen and say, we're gonna sing this today, because that's not gonna go over well, probably. So start with a type of song that is similar to what you're already doing, that you can explain very succinctly, this is why we're gonna sing this, and then eventually, over time, you add to that. You don't need to make a distinction between this song is from our tradition and that song is from their tradition. Because if introduced properly and gradually with a bit of teaching, their tradition and our tradition, we start to realize have a lot of commonalities. So you need to consider, when you're thinking about how does this song fit in our worship, consider the structure of the song. This is what Jacob talked about earlier. Certain types of song work well in certain parts of worship. So I'll name you 3 types of song that you'll find with global hymnody. The first is sequential, the second is cyclical, and the third would be responsorial. So sequential would be one train of thought continued over several stanzas and brought to some kind of climax or conclusion. This would be a lot of our Western Protestant hymnody. So you've got holy, 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 you've got the stanzas, they sing through the same melody, each one, and then eventually it comes to the climax at the end. And there are examples of that type of hymnody from other parts of the world.
Yeah, one that just came to mind when you were talking about that in Celebrating Grace is Yesu, Yesu, fill us with your love. I don't know if you know that. It's 656 in Celebrating Grace. You can tell I grew up in one of those, I grew up going to Sunday evening singing 656 in the green hymnal. So it has that refrain that comes back over and over, but it has stanzas that the text changes each time. Another example, we sang last year in worship at Alleluia during communion on Thursday. We sang one called The Rice of Life. It's an Ito Lo text that has one of those hard to sing Asian melodies that I was talking about. I think it goes over well when you have good instrumentation and a congregation like Alleluia that can actually pick it up really quickly. Yeah.
You can begin to branch out using this style of song. Jot down the name Shirley Murray. Shirley Irene Murray, M-U-R-R-A-Y. She's from New Zealand. She's a fairly well-known hymn composer. The fact that she lives on the other side of the world can be a bit of an introduction to using songs from around the world. Her theology may challenge your church's theology a little bit too. It'll stretch it some. But her texts are often they're set both by Western composers and by non-Western composers. So
Last name again is?
Murray, M-U-R-R-A-Y.
Oh,
Shirley Murray.
Shirley Murray. So that's sequential. Cyclical would be a short text, usually a refrain that repeats as needed. This works well for meditative times, say a Taizé chant, which is usually about 8 bars.
Yeah, 6, 8 bars.
That can just repeat at liberty. It's good for processionals and recessionals if you use those. Really, a cyclical type of song is appropriate anytime that it's inconvenient to hold a hymnal or to look at a screen, because these songs are quickly memorized and can be just sung over and over.
Think Santo, 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 mi corazón te adora. That's one that my church uses very often, in fact, and one that they've really grown to love over a couple of years. We introduced it first as a choral anthem, and then moved it to a congregational piece.
John Bell has used a lot of cyclical songs this week, like Mungu ni mwema Mungu, or Know that God is good, know that God is good, know that God is good, God is good, God is good. That's a whole song. So your congregation can learn that in probably 2 or 3 minutes if you teach it bit by bit. And then it's in the memory and you can sing it as needed. Responsorial songs, as you might guess, combines aspects of those other two. Usually it's a refrain that reinforces the overall theme of the hymn, and you can introduce that refrain. Leaders can sing the stanzas at first, the congregation can sing the refrain. Eventually everybody can sing together. We've used a number of those too in our worship sessions this week. So I've challenged myself to think in terms of what is the structure of this song, and so how does it fit in the worship? Should I do it at the beginning as a welcome song? Could I do it during the offertory? Where can we use this type of song? And that varies depending on this liturgical tradition of your church, how your church structures its worship. So now, with no further ado, working with the songs.
Yeah, so we'll move kind of quickly through this section and leave time hopefully for some questions if you have them. Working with the songs, no performance practice, but don't aim for replication. You're hearing that from us. That may not be what you hear from everybody, but I think there are some really helpful volumes that give you a good discussion and kind of primer on it. Michael Hahn's Holly, 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 Sing the World, We Sing the World Round. It gives you a lot of performance practice background and talks about what instruments you might use, what context liturgically it might fit in. Great book, harder to come by these days, getting tougher to come by. They have them at the Choristers Guild booth, and you can still get them from Choristers Guild, but they're harder to find than they used to be.
This book comes in 2 editions.
Yeah.
This is the teacher's edition.
Yeah,
Teacher's guide. The other
which has
one-
all the performance practice
Yeah,
stuff.
the other one's the more of a choral type. It just has the music in it.
Right.
I'd recommend this one so you have the background of the pieces.
Mm-hmm. Same thing for the Iona stuff has some less performance practice than that does, but it talks about the context that it comes from, which I think is really helpful. There are 2 volumes from Iona that there's more than that, but the 2 that are mostly dealing with global songs are Sent by the Lord and Many and Great are those 2. They're should be on that resource list on the back of your handout.
They're not in the shop this week.
Right.
As far as
I don't think so.
Do any of those have demos with them?
They do. Almost
Really?
all of them have recordings. Yeah, all 3 of those and this one all have recordings,
Okay.
which is really helpful. That's a great question. Yeah.
You can't just get some of those performance practices off the written page.
Right, yeah.
No, and you'll find that this is they're authentic recordings that Michael Hahn did in places when he was doing field research. Some of them, so they sound very non-Western. These are sung by people in Scotland, and so you can tell the difference. Honestly, these are recorded by people in the UK. So while they're still doing it and they're aiming for some authentic performance practice, it's not quite the same as that. Or the recordings that come with the global praise stuff. They're very, I think, very performance practice minded as well.
Let's skip down a bit.
Yeah,
For recordings, also look at YouTube. Type in the title of the song, and you may find recordings that seem more authentic to their original creators, and you'll find recordings that a church somewhere else has done. And listen to both of those and get ideas.
right. Right.
But yeah, I try to note on the bibliography which of the volumes has a companion CD. Usually it's sold separately, which is unfortunate. But like I said, YouTube has at least as much, as many recordings as the CD.
One thing along with that, with this adaptation, understand the instruments that are originally used, but find other ways to replicate those sounds. Like when we did Rice of Life last summer, we used cello and violin and did some pizzicato things because we didn't have the instruments that would have originally been used in that culture to make those sounds. So we contextualized it to what we had and made the most of what we had, and actually got a really good sound, I thought. Learn the basic pronunciation of the text. There's some of them are hard. But believe me, when we went to Malaysia, we sang a couple songs in Chinese, and I don't know that we ever got them right. They said that they praised us for being close, but it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life was trying to learn Chinese for a couple of songs. But learn the basic pronunciation of the text. Most of them aren't that hard, especially if you're looking at things from South America or Africa. Most of the languages are, using Latin vowels and that sort of thing. It makes sense. It's important to understand performance practice, but more importantly, it's important to understand where the song came from, what context it was born out of, and there are a lot of resources today that can help you do that.
So once you understand where the song came from and how it was performed there, then you simply adapt it to your context. And our philosophy is that that's perfectly fine. It needs to be meaningful to the congregation, and if they're afraid to do it, it's not meaningful, and if they think they can't sing it, then it's not going to be very meaningful either.
Agreed.
So adapt instrumentation. If you need to, adapt a particularly challenging rhythm or melodic figure, if you need to. Don't print it that way if it's under copyright. But in performance, you can change that if you like. As far as text, if you find, most of these will provide an English versification that you can use. If you find a text that doesn't have an English translation, be really, really careful. The proper way to do it is to translate it exactly, so you have the exact translation in English of what the original meant, and then versify that into a form that's usable with the song. And if you're not skilled in that, I'm not skilled in that. I have somebody else do that sort of work. Otherwise, if you just take a stab at here's what I think the song means or what it means to me, you're not really paying your dues to the people who created it. Does that make sense? When I use the songs, I always provide the English for my congregation because I wouldn't want to sing a song if I don't know what I'm saying. And they appreciate that. So we always do the English. We sometimes do the original English.
Okay, we'll talk a little bit about working with the congregation. So our task as worship planners and music leaders is to go beyond just leading a song to helping the congregation connect with the song and with the places from where it comes, the people that created it. In the case of Global Hymnody, we function within the majority cultural tradition of our congregation, but we can function beyond it. It's that prophetic kind of role that you were talking about. So understand your congregation. That's of utmost importance. We often have false assumptions about who our congregation is that we've created in our mind. So know your congregation's musical abilities or their inabilities. And that might be the more important part, is know what they can't sing and challenge them on occasion, but don't go so far beyond what they can do that they're never going to be successful with it. And I think that's a challenge, that's a problem that a lot of people introducing not just global songs, but any new song don't pay enough attention to. Be familiar with your congregation's cross-cultural experiences. Some churches have had a lot of people who've traveled well abroad and visited other cultures, some don't. And so you need to know that. Know their stories. Ask people about their stories and connect the music that you're singing to those stories in some way. Have people share testimonies about their experiences. When in my particular case, our church took a group to Ethiopia a couple years ago, and I searched and searched for a proper Ethiopian song to use, and I couldn't find one that I thought would work well with our congregation. And so we had done a lot of songs from Africa in the past, and I started just connecting those. And I know that different countries in Africa are not the same. I'm not not saying that at all. But when they heard similar sounds, those people who had been, there's always this connection back to, I need to get back to Ethiopia, to those people that we were serving there and loving on as kids. And so there's always this moment whenever they hear those songs that they've connected to that experience. It's a powerful moment in our church. If there are multiple ethnicities in your church, your neighborhood, or town, do a bit of research to find the hymns that they sing. Use these songs not as a novelty, but as a bridge to your community, that missional aspect.
So you'll teach the song to the congregation, which we'll address in a moment, but you're also going to inform the congregation about the song and its background. So I don't think that a full justification of why we should use global hymnody, you don't need to give that every time. You don't need to give this lecture every time you use a global song. But you do little tiny bits and pieces, through time. In the worship service, but also outside of the worship service. A small comment about, we also need to think of Christians around the world or other cultures. And those add up to eventually your congregation may begin to realize why we're singing songs from other places. When you stand up on a Sunday and introduce a global hymn, make your explanation as brief as possible. So always think about it beforehand. Know what you're going to say. You want to discuss perhaps the reasons for singing the song, the beliefs that it will introduce to the congregation. Like you'll notice it says this, and point that out. Talk a bit about the people who created the song. Where do they live? What's their socioeconomic condition? What's the religious climate there? Maybe if there's a specific situation that led to the creation of that song, which would be noted in these books, you could share a bit of that too. What this might look like. In March 2011, you remember the giant earthquake over near Japan, big tsunami. Incredible disaster for the Japanese nation. Shortly after that, I did some research and found a Christian hymn from Japan written by a Japanese Christian and introduced that to the congregation. And I simply said, we're all aware of the crisis going on in Japan. This affects our brothers and sisters there, our brothers and sisters in Christ. And so we're going to sing with them this morning this song from Japan. Here it is. And so I told them, I can't speak Japanese, but here's my very best Japanese. Just sang a stanza, and then I said, hum along in English, or hum along while I sing a stanza in English. Now let's all sing a stanza in English. But just that little bit of relating to a current event, that little bit of background makes it meaningful and helps the congregation to understand why they're doing that.
I think it's very important that we really teach these songs. So don't just get up and put the music in front of them, because likely the chances of success with that are pretty low usually, unless you're in a group like what we have here at the Alleluia conference. But even you noticed John Bell yesterday took the time to teach those songs before the worship service began. So we support that model. I think that's a great way to do it. That means you have to know the songs really well, backwards and forwards. You have to know where the phrase breaks are. So I can teach these 4 bars, have them sing it back. Teach these 4 bars, have them sing it back. So knowing the form again of the song is crucial. If you know they're going to struggle with a few notes in some places, think about how you might need to change that to make it fit for your congregation. Use humor, because keep it lighthearted. People can often get discouraged when learning new songs, especially when you move as fast as John Bell might. In trying to teach those songs, the people who fall behind can be discouraged by that. So keep it lighthearted. Stephen will talk about getting out of the way. That's an important. We can be in the way most of the time when we lead these songs.
Well, minimize the significance of mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely.
sometimes I'll even say, listen, we're not gonna sing this perfectly, but we're gonna sing it. And that's okay. And if it's totally, totally wrong, then say, okay, well, let me sing it one more time, great, let's join again, you know?
Well, even in
And-
these sessions, we've had a lot of varying melodies.
Oh, yeah.
Uh-huh.
as in the John Bell sessions.
Absolutely.
You know, and it's just not, it's not an issue.
Yeah,
The
right.
next time you do it, it'll come closer, if
Yeah.
it's something that you're gonna repeat.
Right, exactly.
So, once the congregation understands why we're doing this, once they've learned the song, get out of the way, if at all possible. If they know it, be sensitive to how they're singing, and if they know it, then step back a little bit, let them carry the song. Also be flexible with how you use the song. You don't always have to do it 4 times in English. Do it in English, do it in Portuguese, in English again, have this side of the room, that side of the room, men, women, children, you know, divide up the congregation for responsible and so on. Just be flexible with the form and how you use the music.
A couple quick ideas for introducing songs in the congregation. Stephen already talked about connecting it with events that have happened. So natural disasters, you know, attacks, all those kinds of things. Help the choir use the choir to help teach the song. Often I bring in, I know I'm going to teach a new global song. I'll find a choir anthem that my congregation or that my choir can sing to get that in their ears. Or we'll use it as a prelude or a postlude or something like that for a couple of weeks. GIA is really the place to go if you want to find choral anthems with global songs. It's a vast repertoire list of global songs. GIA is a Catholic publishing house out of Chicago. That would be the first place to go for choral anthems. Or have children introduce the hymn. Nobody's going to complain if the children sing it first. That's the go-to. Same thing with if I'm introducing a new contemporary song in church. Have the kids sing it first, and the kids eat it up, and their enthusiasm is contagious, you know?
Yeah,
and
the kids love to sing in other languages, or to
Absolutely.
learn that this song is from Nigeria or something.
And it's
And
not
they get to play percussion.
yeah, and it's not difficult for them. Whereas learning the other languages might be really difficult for us. They pick it up faster than you would imagine. Use it in conjunction with mission trips, that sort of thing. Certain times of the Christian year, think Pentecost. Singing in other languages during the Pentecost season makes a lot of sense, right? World Communion Sunday, which comes in October, is a good time to utilize these songs. Advent. There are great songs that talk about the incarnation from around the world and the birth of Christ. Teach them before the service. I sometimes use as a prelude, if we're going to do a new song, I'll get up and teach, the refrain to it. And then when we come back to it in the worship service, I'll sing the first stanza, and the choir will join on the refrain, or the congregation will join in on the refrain, the choir will sing the second stanza again on the refrain, and by the time you get to the third stanza, the congregation can usually pick it up, at least minimally. And they've already got the refrain because you taught it. So teaching in chunks like that, I think, is a good way to do that.
And it's such a good thing to have John Bell here. He is one of the best distributors and teachers of global hymns. And you notice that he just knows that we can do it when he teaches it. He doesn't second guess us. He just says, we're going to sing this. He moves it along. He's sensitive to when he needs to correct something, but he's very good. So I'm taking notes on how he does this, because he's one of the best.
We want to quickly go through a couple of these resources. We've shown you several already. Gather into One, Praying and Singing Globally is a book by Michael Hahn that I would recommend. Just tremendous resource about the history of it and the individuals, the people. He goes by chapters. There's one on Pablo Sosa and Latin American hymnody. There's one on Patrick Masakanyeri and things from Southern Africa. Ito Lo and Asian hymnody. Just a great, an invaluable resource. Worship and the Mission for the Global Church is a new volume put out by the International Council of Ethnodoxologists. It's heavy reading, but the chapters are 1 to 2 pages. So each 1 or 2 pages is a totally different things. So film and art open Tibetan hearts to the gospel, worship in the midst of suffering in Sudan. It's not all music, but there's a great portion of it that is music. So I would recommend that. Another Michael Hahn volume, edited collection that came out in 2013, New Songs of Celebration Render. The global song chapter in here, or his stream, he talks about it as a stream of congregational song, has Pablo Sosa, Dr. Lim, John Bell. I mean, numerous people have contributed to that chapter, the experts.
It's a thick book because it has 7 streams of congregational song, and Global Hymnody is one of those.
Right.
But they're well written, and it's a good introduction to Latin American hymnody, African
Yeah.
hymnody, this sort of thing.
Absolutely.
Those are the heady type of books if you want to learn the background of it.
Right.
Songbook-wise, my favorite one, we showed you a few. This is my favorite to use with kids. I use this with kids ministry.
I use it with my adult choir, and I really,
yeah,
I mean,
use
it's,
it with the congregation.
yeah.
But they're written very simply. They've
Is
got
it Sing
nice
with the World?
Sing with the world.
Sing with the World, yeah. It's got a page of introduction to the thing. It's just a good beginner's introduction to global hymnody.
Yeah. If you're interested in Asian hymnody, we brought along Sound the Bamboo, which is the comprehensive.
Asian
It's
hymnal.
it. It's the Asian hymnal. There are others, but Ito Lo, this is his life's work. He did, I think he did field research in about 40 countries in Asia to compile this hymnal over 40 years, 50 years. And it's a tremendous resource. There is an entire companion volume that's thicker than this that talks about all the performance practice stuff and anything else you might ever imagine that you might want to know is in that. Sound the Bamboo is the name of that.
You'll see on the resource list that items with an asterisk are the ones that we have used and that we know, and that would be the places to start.
Mm-hmm.
But feel free to ask about any other thing. Now we're a little over
Yeah,
time.
we should probably let you go, but if you have questions, we'll be sticking around a few minutes, and we love to answer them. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank
Thank
you.
you so much. Thank you.